As the four children and their mother escaped through the back door, they proceeded silently to the neighboring field where the cloak of the summer night sky provided the necessary coverage. Like a North Star, she guided her children to a small wooden frame home in the distance where they sought refuge from the imminent danger. The trek seemed to take forever, as the children, via hand gesture, were instructed to not make a sound. Even though her children were still relatively young, they fully understood what was happening, and that this was different from the other times. The destination was finally reached, where her suegro assured her it was going to be okay. There was finally safety, but for how long? After all, he was still out there. 24 years ago, I had the opportunity to engage in critical reflection by creating a digital story, based on an oral history that honored the sacrificios that my grandparents, Fernando and Emilia Sanchez, had made for their descendants as a result of immigrating from Mexico to Edcouch, Texas in 1944. No doubt, their story is forever part of my story that I will cherish and proudly share. However, there is more to my story, a story that was never meant to be shared publicly. That being said, I now have come to the realization that the time is now right to unearth what has been buried for too long. This critical autoethnography is the opportunity to unveil the pain and exercise a different politic. After all, according to Guajardo, becoming a public person and an advocate for children, families, and learning communities requires skills that bridge the personal ontologies with the historical, biological, cultural, political, and pedagogical realities of our schools and communities. Integral to this development is an understanding of the self as an educational leader. The leader then becomes the researcher, the instrument for measure, the learner, teacher, cultural worker, and political agent. As a young child, I had always been described as having nervios, or anxiety. Certainly one can look at my formal early education years as uncomfortable, especially since English was not my first language. In hindsight, I now realize that my formal education was anything but natural and inviting. It was actually what Paulo Freire describes as the banking concept of education. Instead of communicating, the teacher issues communiques and makes deposits, which the students patiently receive, memorize, and repeat. Through a post-colonial lens, I now realize that my school teachers were not approaching the aforementioned teaching and learning process with malintent, but rather, they involuntarily became a pawn to the deeply rooted system of oppression. This is made clear by Freire's assertion that education as the exercise of domination stimulates the credulity of students with the ideological intent of indoctrinating them to adapt to the world of oppression. Additionally, the more students work at storing the deposits entrusted to them, the less they develop their critical consciousness, which would result from their intervention in the world as transformers of that world. The more completely they accept the passive role imposed on them, the more they tend to simply adapt to the world. Bannon underscores this by stating that every colonized people, in other words, every people whose soul has an inferiority complex, has been created by the death and burial of its local cultural originality. Indeed, this helps me reconcile while I may have developed and continue to struggle with inferiority complexes despite having successfully attended prestigious institutions of higher learning and achieving positive outcomes while employed at highly touted organizations. However, I have now come to realize that some of the aforementioned inferiority complexes may also be grounded in anxiety that has followed me into adulthood. By speaking to my experience, I hope to shed light on the issues of anxiety that were born as a result of domestic violence and alcohol abuse. In the fall of 2000, I suffered from debilitating general anxiety disorder, where I always felt physically ill to the point where leaving my home became a challenge. Showing up to work was mentally taxing, and traveling was non-negotiable. It all came to a head in December of that year after having completed my first semester of a master's program, while simultaneously teaching full-time at a South Texas high school, working for a nonprofit part-time, and teaching SAT prep courses over the weekend. I could no longer control the overwhelming sensations I was experiencing. They were suffocating. A graduate school classmate, who was a practicing psychologist, immediately diagnosed me as suffering from general anxiety disorder. The anxiety had become so overwhelming that I had to temporarily move back to my parents' home. Shortly after I returned home is when my father admitted that he also suffered from the same ailment and that it could be overcome. He then went ahead and showed me that all I needed to do was to break 2 eggs into a drinking glass and add some alcohol into the concoction. He said this was done para fortalecer los nervios, or strengthen the nerves. When I asked him what could be done if the dose was not enough to strengthen the nerves, he responded by saying, pues échale más alcohol, or add more alcohol. This was the exact moment I realized that my father had been self-medicating with alcohol for the majority of his life. Had this been the reason he would transform from a gregarious man to an unpredictable stranger with violent tendencies? The reason that my stomach was in a constant state of knots as a child, because I never knew which father awaited us. Growing up, I was raised to be a respectful, hardworking person. I also grew up in a patriarchal family structure where the father was considered to be the head of the household. However, the nuance in my family was that my mother also worked full-time. She often worked late hours to keep up with the job demands as a high school attendance clerk. As you can imagine, my father was not too keen on this arrangement and often gave my mother a hard time. At times it was a simple comment. Other times it evolved into an argument. And yet on other occasions, something much worse. In the early 1940s, my paternal grandparents, like my maternal grandparents, immigrated to the United States when my father was a toddler. Just like many families, their life in Michoacan, Mexico was one that was not sustainable financially for a family of 12. The decision was made to come to Wasaco, Texas as farm laborers. No doubt, the laborious experience of working for Anglo farmers was one that was prevalent for the South Texas region at that time. Even though my father attended school, he eventually dropped out in middle school to help his parents in the fields, but also because the educational experience was one infested with blatant discrimination that was not welcoming to him. I am now convinced that these experiences laid the foundation for what Wexley describes as the higher incidence of mental disorders among immigrants who relocate to a cultural environment different from the one that shaped their brains during development, and the increased incidence of depression and other disorders associated with bereavement. Just as my paternal grandfather had resorted to self-medicating with alcohol, so had my father. The politic that I now choose to exercise is one of sharing my reality, as it is also the realities of many of our students who grow up in households where parents resort to self-medicating to treat mental or behavioral disorders. As a result, our educational system may not do enough to be sympathetic to their specific needs, thus resulting in students' own behavioral ailments, causing impediments to their educational and growth journeys. Advocacy is a deliberate act. As educational leaders, our role is to inform, set the conditions, and navigate the advocacy issues necessary for building the public good. The question then is, how do we accomplish this? According to Maturana and Varela, reflection is the process of knowing how we know. It is the only chance we have to discover our blindness and to recognize that the certainties and knowledge of others are, respectively, as overwhelming and tenuous as our own. I now realize that I have functioned with a glaring blind spot, as do so many with traumatic experiences. As a result, we are keyed to action and not to reflection, so that our personal life is generally blind to itself. Not knowing what makes up our world of experience is a crying shame. According to Guajardo, we propose that understanding human behavior begins with the knowledge of self, then moves us toward understanding others. I completely concur, as our educational system must be proactive in encouraging all learners and educators to critically self-reflect in order to shed light on all blind spots to better understand the needs and assets of all learners. Once the self is fully understood, only then can we make meaning of our own reality, paving the way for meaningful teaching and learning to occur at every ecology of knowing, self, organization, and community.